Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is going to be our most practical session on domain-driven design so far. Who's with us here today? I see a lot of people in chat made it live. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for making the intention to join us live. Milan will be a few minutes. He had to take care of something, and he'll be joining in I think about 5 minutes. I will give you a quick intro of what we're doing today. Welcome, everybody. It's awesome to have you. I see we have at least 20, 30 people in chat. A lot of people joining in live, excited. Before we dig in, if you have any questions or if you have any examples of domain-driven design, especially if we're talking about the tactical stuff, the patterns, the conversations, how to go from architecture to actual code. If you have any questions, if you have any suggestions, if you have any aha moments that you're proud of having made and want to share, now's the right time. Let me know in chat. Any questions? What's your favorite part? Saddam, hello. Yes. Hi. Saddam, I think you've been on every episode so far. Am I wrong? It's great to have you. Welcome. So, today's agenda. Today's a bit longer because we had a little bit of scheduling issues. I'm a bit short on time. Milan's a bit short on time, and we don't perfectly overlap. So Milan will be joining soon. We'll be focusing on Milan, what Milan has to say, the code examples that Milan has. He is by far a .NET C# specialist. I'm a polyglot, so I need his help for the practical examples. And then we will sort of dive into the aspects of his project that he created as a kata for his YouTube videos, I believe, which is a event reminder application using a few interesting inversion principles and design principles. And a lot of his students have used that project as a sort of example project. Now the project is not perfect, and I specifically wanted to check out a project that isn't perfect. A perfect project that you can say is, oh, this is my sort of go-to domain-driven design project. That is very impractical, because your real-world project will never be like that. So I like that we have a little bit of mess, a little bit of, let's say, impracticalities, or even maybe just a little bit of clumsy design in a project. I'm not saying that it's bad, but the more stuff that we can find to improve, the better. And since this is something I think Milan created 3 years ago, it's possible that there are some aspects that he would do differently today with his current level of knowledge compared to the Milan from 3 years ago. So there's definitely going to be some aspects of the domain that we can check out. Otherwise, it follows a very how would you say, well-known way of structuring, a very standard way of structuring .NET projects. And he will basically tell us more about that. Hope he didn't forget. He is the special guest of honor today, and he did let me know that he'll be a little bit late. So our agenda today is going over the patterns, especially if you have any questions. So the patterns being mainly the entities, the aggregates, any kind of domain events if you're using them, any kind of repository shenanigans, the actual repositories one, not the framework kind, and anything related to anti-corruption layers. Maybe we'll find some facades or use cases. We're all fan of pure object-oriented programming here and DCI and similar schools of thought. So if there's anything to improve, we will definitely find it. The codebase that we were looking at today is the event reminder repository that Milan shared publicly in his repository. He'll be using one that is, I think, updated on his local machine. He'll tell us more about that. In the meantime, here's the repository in question, and we definitely want to check out what he came up with his entities, with his repositories, with the value objects. One of the core ideas in domain-driven design is that we really want to create a language that helps us. Oh, font size too small, yeah. Yeah. What we want to focus on specifically with our events, sorry, with our the classes interfaces that we create, we want to focus on communicating in a language that represents the domain that we're working on. So if we're working on an event reminder, that's the business might be using jargon specific to how you deal with event reminders. For example, if you use Calendly or if you use Google Calendar, there might be a very specific terminology being used about what is an event, what is a meeting, who is a guest, who is an attendee, what are the differences. If I was invited and accepted and then left, am I still an attendee that is not showing up, or am I not? Do I get emails for updates? Do I not get emails for updates? So it's all those little nitty-gritty details that if you were to focus purely if you were to focus purely on, I'm excited because Milan just said he's coming. He's coming. He's joining he's joining the call. He's joining the session. If you were to start with the database, so one of the things we want to avoid with domain-driven design is this data centrism. So designing, and I get a lot of flack for this because I do sometimes post very clickbaity articles on this on LinkedIn. I'm not saying you shouldn't design your database well. When I say we are avoiding database centrism, is that we don't want to start with the database. See, we want to design our domain first well, and then come up with the best database design that matches our object model. Usually, engineers who learn the basics and then pick up an ORM framework do it the other way around. And that is very, very difficult to navigate. Because then if I start refactoring entities, if I say, oh, I have two entities here, actually what I need is an aggregate, and the entities are table-backed, which have identical backings, that is a mess. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So we have these self-fulfilling prophecy problems. I get this argument every time I post something about TDD refactoring or databases. I have a few very, very diligent and disciplined followers on LinkedIn who show up to every one of those posts and analyze and dissect everything I said that was wrong. But they are coming from a place of database centrism, where if you say the database has to be designed to never be changed, then you are creating a system where you will never be able to change the database. And that is a problem, because as software engineers, one of our tenets for high quality software is that what we're using is easy to change. Now, I'm not saying the database should be easy to change. I'm saying that the classes should be easy to change. The objects should be easy to change. If we figure out that we modeled the classes correctly. It's not even that we didn't know or that we were stupid, but we modeled them correctly. And then the business changed. The business went from selling books to selling cars. Now the code has to adapt. If you now communicate that I can't change the code, my code is about selling books. We need to create a new system. That's a problem. Right? Because if it was easy for the business to go from books to cars, it should be easy for the system to go from books to cars. That's what we want. We want the code to match the flexibility of the business. Usually the business decisions are the hardest. What we don't want to do is avoid business decisions because the database is coupling us to some weird contracts with the classes or with the ORM. Sometimes we can change it. It's the framework that prevents us from changing it. The framework just says, oh, I don't know, this is incompatible, migration not allowed, please start a new project. And then that's what developers do. Start a new project becomes, oh, I'll spin up a new microservice, and then all hell breaks loose. So we're definitely going to be talking about that. Milan is coming. if you have any questions about anything you might have faced in your journey, or I don't want to share sound. There we go. In your journey with domain-driven design, with the tactical patterns, what did you struggle with? I know what my students, what my coaching clients struggle with. What do you struggle with? Why did you decide that I don't want to miss this? When you do DDD, are you questioning whether you should or should not? Do you like the repository pattern and the entity patterns? And do they neatly match uh, entity framework and your favorite ORMs, even if you're not a C# developer? What is it that makes it so interesting to you? Because to me, domain-driven design was always fascinating. The repositories are a very good match for any kind of database abstraction, because I used to do AWDB or Active Record, or there was always something weird about it, especially when I had to deal with this idea of, well, at some point my entity has to know how to get the reference to another entity. And that's annoying, so I'll just introduce a repository, and then the repository will hide the entity manager, and the entity manager helps me sort of deal with that and decouple that and invert the dependencies. But that took like 10 years. It took the industry 10 years to go from this sort of SQL in views to model view controller to then have ORMs, which are not invasive. Not invasive meaning that you don't have to extend, that your class that encapsulates the object doesn't have to extend something that is a abstract entity or abstract table record or something like that. Because that's where we started in the early 2000s. And it's only been about 25 years since then, right? So, I mean, if you look at it, XUnit by Kent Beck, that was invented about the same time, and we still use that. Now, we did make some progress on it, and Milan is joining. Milan, when you give me a nod, like, I'll add you to the stage. We can't hear you yet, so you gotta have to use the private chat. You can do a quick sound check. I can't hear you, by the way. I can see that you're backstage, but you gotta give me a sign that you want to join. You want to join? All right, let's go. Everybody, say hello to Milan.
Okay. Hello, everyone.
How are you doing, Milan?
Can you hear me just fine?
Yes, sound is perfect.
All right. I'm doing great. Just got back from my workout that I mentioned, and now it's time to write some code.
All right. I did share the link that you shared with me about the repo. I do believe you said you updated it to the latest version. So
yeah. So let me give a small background about the repository. It was a project I did a few years ago for some university project where I tackled with domain-driven design. And at the time, it was implemented in .NET Core 3.1, which was the latest version then. But I didn't touch it for a few years. And now I realized I don't even have the .NET 3.1 runtime. So I said, I'll just update it to .NET 7. And surprisingly, the whole migration ended up being just updating the project files to use the new SDK and updating the NuGet packages. No breaking changes whatsoever, except Mediator. But that was a minor one.
Okay. Do you want to run us through the project real quick? I'm excited about the domain and the infrastructure layer. That is what I would like to focus on.
Yeah. So do you think I should share my Visual Studio solution?
Yes. And if you could increase the font size a little bit, I think that would be the best.
Yes, awesome. So
and then I'll manage chat while you're going around the studio, and then we'll pair in a way. So I just need to get the layout right. So we're gonna have the screen layout. Yeah. I'll stop sharing. You can present now, and then we can dive in. I do have chat open, so
let me switch to that chat.
The number of
hello Saddam.
Hello Saddam.
How are you doing?
I just said Saddam was here for almost every episode, so one of our most loyal fans.
Saddam is the man.
The view counter in the top left on StreamYard is not correct. I do believe we have 35 people live. Looking at my my analytics on LinkedIn and YouTube. So because right now it says 0, but it's broken. So on your UI, I think it says 0. But I know that we have a lot more people joining in live. Hey, Pavle.
All right. So I think I'm sharing the screen. So can you confirm?
Yes, you are sharing the screen, and I added it to the
Awesome.
stage. We are now officially on the screen.
Let's check out the domain project. Yes. I don't know why I'm seeing all these files, but whatever. So this project is using grouping by types, which is why we have an entities folder, an enums folder, events, repositories, and so on. So let me see where to start. I guess we'll start with the user, and I'll just briefly explain what the idea is behind the entire application. So the name of the application is Event Reminder, and it's supposed to serve like some, let's call it mini social application where you can connect with a bunch of friends that you have, create some social events, some gatherings, and so on, and organize everyone when the event should be, where it should be located, and so on. So there's not that many entities inside of the domain. The main one is the event, which isn't the happiest of names because it could mean multiple things. And then there are multiple types of events. You can see that this class is abstract. Should I zoom in a little bit more on this?
I think the font size, if you would increase the font size, it would make a lot of our older viewers like myself who are wearing glasses a little bit happier.
All right.
It's not that the font is too small, but I believe the encoder that StreamYard is using to share your screen loses a little bit of granularity.
Is this a bit better?
In the font. This is a lot better, yes.
Okay, let me see if I can squeeze in a bit more. That should do it.
Hello, Manos. Hello, Abdesetar.
All right.
Hello, Christos.
So
it's great to have you. Go ahead, Milan. Sorry.
Yeah. I'm thinking of like what would be the best way to explain the domain. And my thought process is maybe pick up a use case and then go, let's say, top down from there.
Yeah,
what do you think?
Let's do that.
All right. So the use cases. So the project is following the clean architecture.
Perfect.
You can see we have
we have a course on that, so you gotta pitch that at the end of the episode. I don't want us to forget that.
although the course is following some newer ideas, but this was what I could come up with at the time. I'm not the happiest with this solution, but
that's good. I like that.
Yeah. But I have seen similar implementations like this one in production on quite a few projects. And I mean, it works, right?
So, what are you not happy with?
Yeah, I mentioned right at the start that I'm using grouping by types. So you'll see folders like entities, events, repository services, and so on. I much prefer grouping by features, aggregates, whatever you like to call it, because you end up having a much more cohesive set of files together inside of a single folder. So maybe we can even attempt to do some sort of refactoring on the domain project later on to see how it would look like if we wanted to switch from grouping by type to grouping by feature.
Perfect. So we're talking about like top-down vertical slice architecture, so that we would
something
slice
like that. Although I haven't really used like full-blown vertical slices. I like the idea, but I still like kind of applying it across my clean architecture layers, because I get the benefits of vertical slices.
Yeah.
And I can still use the separation that I get with the clean architecture that I personally prefer.
We got an enthusiast. See, one of the things that always worries me is when I see a project like this in the wild, From glancing the top level, I don't know if this project has 5 features or 5,000.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing I'm worried about the most is when I open the entities folder, I see 100 flat files without any further folder hierarchy. Like, that is the worst that can happen. And engineers avoid this because if they were to introduce a folder hierarchy, they will quickly realize that they have to use that folder hierarchy and then synchronize it in the entities folder, in the repositories folder, in the services folder, in the value object, and then every top level folder requires exactly the same kind of folder hierarchy duplicated across it horizontally.
Well, that's awesome. I mean, we'll try to do that right now, and we'll see if it ends up being too much to tackle. I don't think it will be so difficult, but you never know.
You never know. You don't have tests, right? For this part doesn't have.
Sadly, no. Sadly, no. So let's open up the application layer. And here you can see the grouping is a little bit different than the domain. So it's kind of like conflicting ideas, right? In the domain, we're grouping by type. And here we are in the application grouping things by
use case, a role.
Let's call it entities. I don't know, something like that. So we have the attendees, and you can see the attendee entity here. Let's say friendship requests folder. We have a friendship request entity, friendships folder, friendship entity, and so on. So let's not go through all of them.
But this is a great example because I have seen projects like this.
Yep.
In the real world. Sometimes you just get confused and you're like, well, my API is following, slash and then the entity group, and my UI project is following this, what's in it's in the domain folder, right? It's like structured following the guidelines of the framework. And usually, in Symfony, in PHP, it would be exactly this. In MVC.NET, it would be exactly that. In ASP.NET, it would be exactly this. In Ruby on Rails, it would be exactly like the domain project, right? So there are consequences to following let's say, the generic recommendation of the framework. But we as engineers, we got to be realistic. The framework never knows about our project. So we should I always recommend that we structure our project to the needs of our project, not to how the framework says we should, because the framework is optimizing for its own benefit. It's like, how does the framework organize folders so it's useful for the framework users, not for the users of the business that you're building software for.
So there's two sides of that coin that I always found interesting. So you're mentioning how the framework wants it. That's one thing. And then there are a few architectures, such as the clean architecture, that are more or less prescriptive in how you should organize your projects. And this can be both good and bad.
Yes.
So why is it good, first of all? Well, just exactly because it's prescriptive. Yeah. And this is a really good thing for a lot of teams that don't have maybe extensive experience with architecting projects. And they have a really nice template that they can use and start with and end up with a functional solution.
Yeah.
On the other hand, when you take it too far, for example, one thing that always bothered me with clean architecture, with a few implementations that I've seen, is having interfaces for everything.
Yeah.
Just to
I see that a lot in hexagonal as well, where there's interfaces for everything, and then the default impl suffix.
Yeah, always just one implementation.
Just one implementation, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just to achieve some sort of decoupling from external concerns, whereas most of the time you will never really need that.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I like that there is an interface and a default implementation and a testing friendly implementation that might bring things that are out of process into the process. So a database might be out of process and you might replace it with a in-process database, because that's what we do with unit testing. I think we shouldn't be talking so much about unit testing, integration testing, end-to-end testing. It's 2023. What we want to do is to run everything in process. In process means if you deploy it on Git, if you deploy it on Bitbucket, if you deploy it on GitLab, it should be capable of running itself in process in the GitHub Actions without connecting to anything over the external network. It can still set up something really quickly, very light, and then destroy it once it's done. But it should be able to test something in process. And that is still a unit test because it's testing in process. Like, it's not about testing a class or a function. That is the sort of 90s, 2000s way of thinking about small scale testing. That's not what we want. But what I did see, you mentioned this idea that it's prescriptive and then that can be good for teams because you have a boilerplate. And there's nothing worse than just copy pasting 7 microservices and making 8 new ones. And each one of them has similar but slightly different folder structures or setup scripts or scheduler scripts or cron job or deployment instructions. I hate that. 2 projects, they're different, no problem. 20 projects, please. I don't wanna learn the deployment strategy for every project separately. Right? So if you have 20 microservices, please make yourself a favor and just equate the deployment strategy for each one of them. But Kevlin Henney has this amazing talk. It's 3 hours. It's a keynote for a conference where they booked him in a way too small conference room, and it's just like crowded with people. And Kevlin Henney says, good architecture is when I am working with the problem that's in front of me, and only that. Bad architecture is when I am fighting the past decisions. Right? So bad architecture would be, there's this prescriptive boilerplate I have to follow, and I'm fighting it, and I'm going around. Right? So and this happens a lot in large companies with ivory tower architects, where they say, no, when you add something, this entity needs to go into that project, and this entity needs to go into that project. And what do developers do? They find a way so that they don't have to collaborate with those 3 other teams, and they do it themselves. And they spin up a nano service that will just have what they need. And then they say, synchronize this, please, with you when you're ready to integrate with us. Right? So prescription also has the downstream effect of if it creates friction and it requires asynchronous handoffs to another team, the team will fight it and they will find another solution. And sometimes that fight manifests as we will use microservices, not because we need them, but because that is our form of rebellion against prescription. And that is a very bad reason to use microservices. Right? It's like, it's really hard to talk to that server. I will yoink out copy-paste code and spin it up for myself here. And then that creates a whole another level of mess. And if it's named, like you just mentioned, then no problem. But if it starts having a life of its own, it's like you have this project, the new project is a slightly more modern way, then 2 years later there's a newer project, and then every new project, every new microservice has a newer, better way of organizing the project, and then that just creates a whole mess because every project is done different. Which for small teams is good, large teams terrible. So which use case do you want to look at, Milan?
I don't know. I opened up the users folder, and I wanted to comment on, again, grouping things by type. So we have like this top level folder, which is the users. And then inside of it, you have the commands, events, and queries. And then just a few commands inside, 1 query, and a few event handlers. And these are essentially your features, the bottommost folders. And what I would do, what I am doing right now is just getting rid completely of the commands, events, queries naming. And it's already clear from the name of the folder or the feature, let's call it a feature, what this is. So if it's a create user, okay, that's a command. If it's an update user, okay, this is a command. If it's a get something, then I know it's a query.
A get is sometimes a command as well. We gotta be careful. But usually a get user by ID is a
it's never a command. And then we can discuss about the events because okay, let's walk through a use case. So let's say we have the create user use case. Let me just adjust this.
To follow what you said, in a feature-driven naming convention, so vertical slice or something, or anything domain-centric like clean architecture,
yes,
you would want to remove the taxonomy from the folder hierarchy and use the top-level folder to denote the feature. So here the feature is on the most bottom level of the hierarchy, so you need to know where it is before you can find it.
Yes.
So you need to know what it is in order to find it. But with a top-level folder structure, you know what it is, and then you can explore it to see how complex it is, how many moving parts it has. And I heard you mention that whenever you use clean architecture, the feedback from your coworkers is that, oh, this is a lot easier to work on. That's a conversation we had in our podcast.
Yep.
Earlier.
Well, even if you, I mean, basically the concept that you need to grasp here is we have a concept of a use case, which essentially represents one small feature inside our application.
Yes.
And then the purpose of this use case is, let's say it's a command or a query. So a command is something that takes our domain entities, probably using a repository, or you can even use entity framework directly.
Yep.
I don't really have a big problem with that. And then you do something with those domain entities, which is essentially your use case, and then you persist that.
Yeah.
So that's the basic most definition of a use case. And then a query is just give me something from the database and return that to the user.
Yes.
And I mentioned a few times the misconception about a command that it can't return any data. I think while I agree with that, I agree with that definition. Yes, but I think you definitely need to return data from a command sometimes.
Yes.
But the concept of returning data from a command is very different from returning data from a query because the intent is different. And usually, when you are working with a command and you need to return something, it's already going to be in memory, most likely. And you won't really need to go to a database or some external service to obtain something and then return it most of the time.
I think the best. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, continue.
So on that topic, I hear this. So what you're describing is CQRS. So it's command query request segregation, and sometimes it's just CQS. It's just command query segregation, right? So why is CQRS different from CQS? Because on CQRS, what we're doing is, I mean, if I use the request segregation, if it's responsibility segregation, it is CQS. So it depends on, again, which interpretation we're using. But the point is that CQRS, in the modern way of that we handle the infrastructure side of CQRS, is that it usually has a asynchronous web channel based protocol to commit the, so if you use TCP, for example, I can tell you, yeah, this is a void command, but the TCP packet on the infrastructure level has to acknowledge that it arrived. So even though we're not returning anything from the void command, we are returning something onto the network layer. So something flows back, right? So what description I would use here, because I think this gets mixed up a lot with the purist sort of interpretation in clean code from Uncle Bob Martin, where he said, functions should either be void functions and do stuff, or just return something without side effects, right? Yeah. So they should be void and have side effects, or they should just return stuff without having side effects. I think this idea of functional purity gets mixed with CQRS commands and queries, and it is not appropriate. Because this idea that it shouldn't return something, from the way I coach when I practice CQRS with a team, is I tell them the command should not return something that is not query specific if it has to. So the command can return a transport protocol return value, right? So you query an endpoint. In this case, let's be concrete, create user. So if this create user endpoint is called through a web-based API, it would be in my best intention to return a status code, to comply with some, modern, good API practices. I might return a header to denote, to avoid any kind of cross-site request forgery attacks, right? So I will be returning something, but I'm not returning anything that is not query specific from the command itself. I might return an ID sometimes, and that can be dangerous. I would rather prefer the ID was sent in to not expose any internals and like auto increments or auto-generated or remote-generated IDs. But what I wouldn't do is say the command needs to know what the interface will need to update itself. So the command will contain a smaller, how would you say, derivative projection for what the user interface will need, because then you're coupling the command with the user interface. It's the query that should know what the user interface needs and what the minimal representation of that is. And if you want, you can have the query be called, and then you can have the command mutate state, and then you can tell it, when you're done, give me this query.
Yeah.
And then that's exactly what we do with GraphQL. GraphQL exactly captures that kind of mutation to query transition, where it says do this and then return me this request. But that's two separate requests. That's not one request. So it would be a violation of separation of concerns if I have a command and the command does mutation and it has a return value that perfectly matches what the UI needs. That is the mess, because then you mix ordering, then you have to make it synchronous, then you have to make it immediately return. Engineers start optimizing all kinds of weird, crazy scenarios. You can't use a message queue anymore. It has to sort of, you get sagas everywhere already immediate, and it just goes deep. We have some comments in chat. Saddam says, we can use n-layer architecture. Hang on. We can use n-layer architecture, clean architecture with DDD or without DDD. Here we know what the folder structure should be or how we design our backend project. And my question is, if someone wants to implement those APIs using Blazor, React, or any front-end framework, what are the best practices for consumption? You got any words of advice on that?
So I get this question quite often. And my usual answer is I don't do front-end.
Mm-hmm.
But in my eyes, it doesn't make a lot of sense to repeat this same architecture that you have on the backend, also on the front end.
Mm-hmm.
What I see done in most of the teams I've worked on is some sort of simple, let's call it service-based system on the client side, where you have, and it's usually like some single-page application.
Yes.
Let's say Blazor here. So in the Blazor application, you would have pages, and then a page would be one or more components, and each component would be able to inject the services it needs, and the service is the one communicating with the backend API.
I agree with that. And Nick Shomeko, for example, he does a lot of enterprise-level React applications. That's exactly how he would advise you do it. Keep the framework separate, keep the components specific to Storybook or something design-specific, because it is cosmetics primarily that you're after on a front-end project. And then have that middleware, what you would have 10 years ago or 15 years ago to have considered the sort of CGI responsibility, PHP level sort of behavior, that's backend behavior, that is now usually living in the service layer of the front-end framework. Have that in some kind of service layer that has its own domain layer on the front end. That's completely okay. Because in clean architecture, generally what we want to do is have one domain talk to the other domain, right? So you have two onions, and then the domain of one onion is talking with the domain of the other onion. It's just that we have infrastructure concerns of how they are connected. Now, Saddam did mention something interesting, right? In that I would make an exception here. So to your answer, I would make an exception in two cases. When you have a C#.NET backend and Blazor, which means that the front-end framework and the backend framework are using the same stack.
Okay.
If they can live together in the same repo, in the same vertical, then I would definitely start merging the front and the back a little bit more intimately, and then just have like a light infrastructure layer between them, or maybe even just an application layer between them. And the same exception goes to front-end frameworks that have back-end and front-end capabilities. So this is Node.js.
Yes, but in
running
that
a
case, if Blazor is coupled with our application, then
yes,
we probably don't have like a concrete API layer, right?
correct. It
Let's
would
call it
be in the domain of having the
Blazor
auto-wired
is actually the
generated.
presentation layer in that case.
Correct. So you would use the service layer, so the middle end of the front end payload as your application layer, right? Because then you want to
And then
think about this project as just having one project, not two.
and that also depends on which deployment model you're using for Blazor.
Mm-hmm.
So there's Blazor server, where you have access to the backend, and then you just return back HTML or whatever the response is. And
So it's
then
a
there's Blazor
traditional,
WebAssembly,
yes.
where you have an actual SPA application that needs to talk over the wire to the backend. So
Mm-hmm.
those are, I guess, a little bit different in terms of the programming model.
Mm-hmm. So it depends on whether you send a payload and then you have to hydrate it to sort of send it dehydrated and then you sort of wire it up with a live backend, or whether the output from the backend is already fully functional but it's not single page. So you'd have to do sort of refresh paradigms, the more traditional way of building web applications.
And another approach I've seen to building front end applications is using something like Redux or any other variation of that, which is very similar to using CQRS on the backend. You
But
have
specifically mediator, like it
yes,
replaces
yes,
the sort of
mediator
message
basically.
chain on the
Right.
message bus.
So I haven't touched that for a few years, but there's a concept of let's call it a message, which you send to a component called a store.
Mm-hmm.
A store then handles this message, and it sends back a success or a failure message, and then you
Mm-hmm.
handle one of those. And
Yes.
in the handlers of those messages, you update the user interface accordingly. So this is very similar to using mediator on the backend.
Mm-hmm. And that is also natural CQRS purely on the front end space, right? Because it has a loop and it always goes in one direction. The command doesn't update state. The command updates the store. The store updates the projections. The projections are what are being presented by the components, right? So the state loop is always flowing in one direction. It can go into an endless loop, which is the main problem that things like React and the Vue.js 2, so Vue 2, the old one, struggled with, where there was, if you're mixing imperative programming with effects and declarative programming with how the component says, bind yourself to this data property, you can accidentally cause endless loops in the update chain, which is what these frameworks are primarily struggling with, educating developers on how to avoid, because it is quite, it's under the hood. It's in the engine somewhere hidden, and it's very hard to debug, especially if the engineer was told that, this is a really easy framework, it will solve all your problems, but there's these dragons underneath the hood that you have to be careful about and have to be an expert in computing to actually debug. So there are trade-offs. So Saddam, thank you for the question. Your other question is recruitment specific. I think we can tackle that when Milan has to jump off, because we do have a little bit more time, but I think Milan, you have to jump off early today.
I'll let you know. I still have some time.
Yeah, I have a hard stopper in 35 minutes, so
okay.
That's we cool.
I think we can go for at least 15-20 minutes more.
Okay, cool. And then Saddam has a second question. If you use Blazor server and then we don't need API, if you use WebAssembly, then we need an API. So I agree with that assessment. You want to continue with the example?
Yes. So I ended up moving from the command to the command handler, which is essentially the implementation of this use case. It's using dependency injection to obtain a few repositories and some services.
Very good.
And then in the handler, we have constructing the value objects used in the domain. If there's any failure, we return an error back to the whoever sent this command. In this case, that's going to be the API endpoint. There's an optimistic check for the email uniqueness.
Mhm.
And I'm also noting that this is susceptible to a race condition, although in reality, you will never run into a problem because at
The
least I
same
hope,
person won't use their own email twice.
that
Yeah.
you will place a unique constraint in the database,
Mhm.
which is going to keep you safe if a race condition ever occurs.
There is a better solution to this, right? Because this ties into the problem of if I do this, the domain layer cannot exist without the invariant enforcement on the infrastructure layer.
Yes.
But there is a better way of dealing with this, which is you can declare the race condition explicitly. You can say whoever came first wins. Right? Because I can register, you can register, but then whoever came first wins the uniqueness, and then you can't log in using that email. I can save both of them, but then I just check, which one wins, which one is the one that is actually active, right? So I have a Milan in the system that owns the email, and a Milan in the system who doesn't own the email, right? So I'm not saying that the emails have to be unique. What I'm saying is that the emails can only be owned by one person in order to log in. Right, so I can make my domain be explicit. So I can have Dennis, I can have my email, and I can create 7 accounts with them. And then I have to decide which account the login goes to. See, it's that decision that we want to prevent by putting a unique constraint in the database. But that's silly because the real domain can just say, oh, Dennis, you created 7 accounts. Which one's your main account? This one, please. Okay. I can keep the other 6 in the system.
What if you forget which one is the proper one?
Well, I'm capable of making mistakes, and I will mark it in the system. This is my main account. This is the account capable of logging in. This is the activated one because you register.
Would you ever do that in reality?
With registration systems.
In general, something that must be unique, give it the freedom to not be.
Yes. Because then I can also scale it. Because you might say it has to be unique, but then I have, or what is the more inclusive term nowadays? Double primary SQL replica, all unique in one database. Right? If I have my database split, sharded into 2 segments, and I'm not using auto increment columns, and you say unique constraint, well, it's not going to be unique in both databases.
Okay.
So both databases can have one. Then I can decide, okay, well, I created it in this database, and I don't exist in that database, or I exist in this database, and I can also exist in that other database, but in that other database, this account, even though it's the same email, can have different state. I can have different orders in this account. You had this problem. We had this problem, Milan. 20 years ago, when I bought books on Amazon, I had a separate Amazon VE account, then I had an Amazon Co UK account, and I had a third Amazon.com account. And these were 3 separate accounts with 3 separate order histories and 3 separate logins. But then they merged them together to MailChimp or whatever they were using, and I only got 1 spam email from them. But it was always for the wrong region because it didn't know how to merge it, because it didn't know which one the primary one was. Right? So this is a real business problem that will happen. Right? So it's not a technical problem to solve, which means that our architect should not be solving it. Our domain-driven design savvy architect should not be using technical tools to solve it. This is a normal problem that people can have. I changed my address a few years ago. Some bills still go to the old address because their IT structure is manual and they forgot to update it in a few places. Right? So Dennis, who is supposed to have a unique address, has 2 addresses. And that's normal. The real world is messy and asynchronous. We should model that. We shouldn't limit ourselves
in that case, isn't it more the case of
There's a question
of different, let's call it different bounded contexts? The postal service has Dennis in one context, and then the real Dennis is actually in a different context on a different address.
Yes.
So you have this discrepancy in terms of what the current value is. To
I wouldn't
them,
say there's a discrepancy. There's a discrepancy in the use case. See, they don't know that Dennis exists there. Their context is I need to know, based on the address, to which postman to give this package to, because the package cannot be digitally replicated. So it has to go to one area first. Right? So which location is the primary location where we try primary delivery? And that's the address that's on the package. Right? So that says that the package claims Dennis lives there, but Dennis might not live there anymore, but it might still be picked up by the neighbor or Dennis's brother, or maybe Dennis's previous tenant lives there now and they will accept the package and then send it to Dennis. The point is that somebody on that address will be there. That's the assumption, optimistically, that they will help you deliver this to Dennis. That's the idea behind the post system. And that's the idea behind an email. When I register and I use my email, the idea is that if you need to communicate with me, you have no idea who I am digitally, which IP I am, which session I am. So you will send it to my email to verify that that's actually me. And that's how I use the post system. But in an application where I register an account and you say, oh no, I have a unique check on your account, I don't need that, especially if it's my first account. Now, if there's two accounts and one of them is 5 years old and one of them is new, then this check makes sense. Right? So if one is already being used actively, I would do this optimistic check. And there's a question by Manos, can we create a domain service for this check? And this is exactly the scenario where you would use this domain service. And this is exactly the same scenario that you've coded. Is there a long-lived one already there that's being used actively? Yes. Okay, so obviously it would be silly of me to already have information that I will never be able to log in to allow this user to create, to go through with this registration. Or in this case, the create user command, right? I might not be registering, I might just be creating a user. I might already be registered, but that in this domain, this might mean something else, right? So the event reminder application might know about Dennis, so it might have sent Dennis an event at some point, but I don't have an account. I don't have a user. I just received notifications through my email, right? So Calendly, for example, has this, right? So you might have a Calendly account, or maybe you were just invited by somebody who has one. But then I can send you emails, but you don't have a user, right? So even though I know about you, you might not have a account. This sort of promoted, I will promote your email to an account now, which is all we're doing with the registration, really. I own my email, not you. So I should decide whether it's unique or not. Because if I say my email +7, if I add a label, I now control a bypass to your uniqueness check. But it's the same email. Right? So this idea that you can check on a technical level uniqueness to have unique people, that's silly. And no domain expert should really be wasting time modeling that, or even solving the problem. Right? This optimistic check is enough.
What do you think about splitting the checks between the application and the domain? In other words, instead of having this user repository check here, and maybe even this hash password, what's your opinion about moving that to the create method here, either in terms of passing the interface or even passing it in as a function?
I would actually move it to the domain layer of the front-end application, if possible. Right? So if a password has to be hashed, and I'm not salting it, right? So if I don't need private information to hash the password, I would hash it on the front end first. Like I would avoid sending it plain text over the wire. But if it's HTTPS and if it's like secure, and I know there's already some best effort in place to avoid man-in-the-middle attacks or snooping, then I wouldn't. But you have was I hacked? There's a website where you can check whether
was I pwned.
Was I pwned? Yeah. So there's a website where you can enter your password, and it'll tell you whether your password exists on.
Yeah.
And please don't go there and enter your real password. But have you ever looked up the talk on how that's implemented?
No.
So
but
they
I don't think it's a password. I think it's an email.
It's the password. It checks whether your password is in any leaked rainbow table for hashed passwords. Right? So, and how it works is that it hashes your password on the client side and then sends only the first 5 digits of the hash to the server. And then the server returns all passwords that match the prefix. And then you on the client side check if your password is in that list. So your plaintext password, even though it needs it to perform the check, never leaves your computer.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So because you might naively think, oh, I will just enter my password here and click send, and that can be misconstrued as a phishing attack. But I can do the same thing here. I can do the same thing here and say, okay, I have my unique email. I'll reserve this email and I have a password. I can actually hash this on the front end. I can just send it to the backend, and then the backend can say, hey, was this hashed correctly? Yes. Okay, let me encrypt it one more time. Right, so it's hashed twice. The hash without a salt on the front end and hashed again with a salt on the backend. Good enough for me. And then the front end can just keep hashing it before it sends it. I think credit cards with PCI compliance, PCI level 2 compliance, I think they have to do that as well. Right, so it's pre-hashed before it's being sent, and then the hash is being checked again on the backend with the CVC. But the CVC is such a silly security mechanism. Like, don't even get me started. So your question was, would I have this here? I would say absolutely not. The handle, I would, the handle command, the handle method of a command processor, I would always want to look like a test. Like, so I would want it to have an arrange, act, and assert stage. Because the use cases, the command handlers of use cases are exactly what you want to unit test.
Mm-hmm.
So I would always say arrange, which is lines 48 till 51. Arrange the request in the correct domain terminology. Act on it.
Up to here.
Yes, but now I would create one more command. Right, so the command is missing. Right, I would say I need a command that expresses create user command. That isn't the request. Right, because your request, I believe, the request object is being passed in as a parameter on line 46. That is a DTO. And so I would separate out the DTO from my understanding of what the command is, right? Specifically to encapsulate it. Right, so this DTO has getters and setters.
This one does not. It is immutable and only getters.
No. I mean, it shouldn't have getters. Right? That I would separate out the command handler from the DTO. Right? The DTO is a plain object with no behavior, so it needs getters to expose its structure. But then the actual command handler, I would say, okay, I have a DTO, create a command, and to whomever I give this command, or maybe the command knows how to resolve itself, execute itself. That's the command pattern. Does the command execute, or does something execute the command? I would then encapsulate the behavior of the command into something that can encapsulate the structure and separate it. Right? So I would say, I have a first name, last name, email, and password. To me, that sounds like a UI concern. Right? So on the UI, it's these 4 fields. But on the command side in the domain, I might say, well, no, the create user is the object that's being created. I'm just verifying that create user is correct. So it will need credentials, an email, credentials, an email mechanism, and a secret. And in this case, it can be first name, last name credentials with an email for identification and a password for secret sharing. But it can also be an OpenID connection token with a secret token with a refresh mechanism, right? And then the credentials can be just a string that was passed to me, and it might say Batman, or it might say Dennis or Dennis C. Right? So I wouldn't want this. I wouldn't want my objects to be anemic all the way through the request protocol to then come up, with this problem of, well, if I change my UI, I need to change my command handler, which means I need to change my domain layer. There's a problem with that. I wouldn't want it modeled that way. So I'd always encapsulate the element, the object that goes into the domain layer, carrying the important user intent. I would always encapsulate that so that I could refactor it. But this is not clear here, right? So I would have a test for this, and I would say, what is the test doing, right? So how would you express this in a sort of test-savvy way? I would say, I need a valid registration request given a state where this user hasn't been registered yet. That's my arrange. Then I want the registration, the create user command, to be sent to the server. The server which controls the repository where the user doesn't exist yet. And then I would assert that after this command has run, that all invariants are still correct. And one of those invariants can be email is unique. Right? So I could insert it into the database, and then you could say, I inserted you into the database, and your email is not unique, so I'm afraid you can't log in. But I can now send you over to the next step where I ask you to change your email. I used to play World of Warcraft, and they do this. It's like, if I don't log into my World of Warcraft account for like 5 years, my username on that server has to be unique. But if I don't log in, they will take away my username and give it to somebody else. Like, they will erase it from the pool. And then while doing that, when I log in after 5 years, they will just give me a random auto-generated string for my username, with which I cannot log in. So I will have a unique username, but my account is now no longer unique because my username is not unique, and it is also in a format that is not allowed, but it is saved in the database. If I refresh the screen, it remains the same. It doesn't regenerate every time I refresh the screen, so it is persisted. It just persisted in a way that does not honor the invariance, which says it has to be unique. So as long as, right, so I'm separating out this idea that I can save it, and I can tell you whether it follows the invariance or not. So I would save the registration, and I would say, I saved your registration, I created an account, but your email is not unique. And not only is it not unique, but you are not the first person who has claimed this email. So I saved all your data, but please change your email. To me, that is a completely plausible scenario.
Yep.
Right? And this is especially important when you have Meta acquired Instagram.
Yep.
And they're merging user bases together. I had an Instagram account and I had a Facebook account, and they had different profile images. Okay. Now I want to keep my profile images on Instagram, and I want to keep my profile image on Facebook. So now I need two accounts with the same email that are on the same database but on separate platforms. So there is now extra steps to the uniqueness. Now, obviously, what you don't want to do is merge them in the same table so that you can have the email and the platform in the same table, so you can have a composite unique check on the big table, because the table might have 7 billion rows, and you don't want it to be hit every time somebody logs in, because that is the worst disaster scenario. Like, I need to hit the 7 billion row table in order for every login. Are you crazy? No, that's not how we're going to architect this, because the business doesn't need the uniqueness check to be that hard. It's not a domain problem. Great question. It's a great discussion. Do you think we have time to refactor it, or do you want to just linger on?
Let's try. Okay. I'll maybe speed run it, but
okay.
If anybody has a question.
I do need to jump to the bathroom, so I will empower you for 2 minutes to entertain our guests.
Yes, perfect. So what I'm going to do is get rid of the top level commands, events, and queries folder. And if you have any questions along the way, just write it in the chat. I'll be following along. So I'll start with literally just cutting out the features that were inside of the commands folder and putting them directly under the users folder. Now this is gonna kill my system for a moment until it updates all of the namespaces. And now I can go ahead and delete the commands folder. I'll do the same for the queries because there's only one query inside, and I'm going to get rid of the queries folder. And then I'm left with the events. Now, if you take a look at the events specifically, we have two of them, the user created and the password changed. Now we have two handlers inside. So let's start with the user created. This is a domain event handler for the user created domain event. Now this event is something that is published inside of the create user feature. So to me, it makes sense to also move the handler and the respective integration event that we are publishing to the queue together inside of this feature folder, which means we will be getting rid of this user created folder under the events. And then the same would happen in the domain event handler for the user password change domain event. Now, I'm not specifically sure where this domain event is raised, so I'll just head over into the method definition, look at the references, and find where in the code I'm raising this event. So what I'm looking for is the add domain event. This is what raises the domain event inside of my domain layer. And then I'll just go back through the references and end up in the change password command handler. Do we have a use case like this? Well, we do. Here it is. And then I'm going to take this domain event handler and the integration event and move them inside of here. So what we started with was a very nested structure with a top level commands, queries, and event folder. And what we are left with is just this. So now we have the users folder and our features are inside. And then based on the name of the feature, you should be able to figure out, is this a command or a query? Essentially, if it has a get, which is a naming convention that I like to follow, it means that this is a query and this is something that returns data. And if it doesn't, then it's a command and it's something that updates the database. Now, another thing I want to comment on is having the integration event definitions inside of the application layer. This is going to be problematic because this means that I now need to define this integration event in multiple places whenever I want to use it. A better alternative would be to have a separate contracts project where all of the integration events would live, and then any interested services would be able to reference that contracts project and get the definition of this integration event. And if you're working with multiple repositories, then how you distribute this is using a NuGet package that contains the integration event definitions. So that's one thing. And then I will probably apply the same convention on the other folders, but let's not do that right now. And I want to move into the domain project. You're back.
Yes.
So just a quick recap. What I did was went from this top level structure into this. So we have just features inside of the users folder. And another extra step that I did was, let's say for each event. So this is the personal event canceled event, kind of confusing, but what we have is a handler for a domain event. I like to place this right next to the command that also raises this domain event.
Agreed.
So in this case, this is the personal event canceled. Okay, I find the use case. Here it is, cancel personal event. So just move the handler right there. Yes. And then it's part of one cohesive whole. And now let's try to do the domain project. Okay. And this is going to be a bit tricky.
Why?
Because I don't have a really good memory of the domain.
Okay.
But let's try. So essentially, we are working with.
Let's do one.
A user. Okay.
I am conscious of time. We have 11 minutes. I want to pitch the course.
a
You can stay
user
on
that,
if you want.
yeah, sure. A user that's part of the system. Then we have a concept of an event, which can be either a group event or a personal event.
Mhm.
Then we have an invitation or an event,
Mhm.
and an attendee. So that's somebody that has accepted the invitation.
Mhm.
And then we have a concept of friendships between users, which is generally unrelated to the events.
Yes, very good.
So I'm seeing, let's say, 3 distinct holes here. So I would try something like, and don't kill me for the naming convention, but let's say users,
Oh, I do
and
like
then
that convention.
and then possibly events, although we already have it. So I'm not sure. So this is where I messed up a few years ago, naming it an event.
Yeah.
Mm,
I mean, it is called
let's
event
call it
reminder. So,
let's
but
call
this
it
is a very good
let's call
point,
it
Milan.
meetups. Yeah.
Milan, Milan, I wouldn't be
Because
harsh on yourself.
because this introduces confusion of what an event is, because now this isn't ubiquitous in our domain. So
No,
I
it
have a
is. It
concept.
is. It
No,
is
but it
like
isn't, because
this is exactly.
I'm trying to use an event for more than one thing. So I have an event representing a gathering of people, right? But I also have a concept of an event, which is
On the
a domain event.
infrastructure. Yes, yes. No, but
So
I agree with
one
this, right?
solution could be to rename this to domain events.
That's
And
exactly
then,
what I wouldn't to do
okay,
because
give me a
the whole.
moment. Give me a moment.
Okay.
Uh, and then we would have the events folder available. So let's go down a route and see where we end up with.
Okay. Okay. I like
So, okay, I'll get rid of the meetups, and then
that.
let's
Cool.
start moving things around. So I'll move the user to the users folder.
Mm-hmm.
And then I know the user has a bunch of value objects. So email, first name, last name, and password. That's what I'm sure of. So move those next to the user. And then nothing is left. Okay, one thing is left
Yes.
in the value object, but we'll get there. Then we have the repository definitions. So let's
Mm-hmm.
move those right next to the user.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And now let's see what we can fit inside of events. So definitely event, group event, and personal event would go in there.
Yes.
And then I can move, let me see if I have repositories for this. So I have a group event repository, a personal event repository. So let's move those.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Because they're cohesive with those with that
Yes.
meaning of the word event.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And then we need to decide what to do with the rest of these.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really open to debate. So, for example, I could have one folder that's related to friendships and friendship requests. So that
Mm-hmm.
could be one concept.
Yeah.
So let's call it, for example, friendships. And then I'd move these to friendships.
Yeah.
I would find the repositories that are in a technical folder, and
Very
I'll
good.
move them into somewhere where it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And then what do we do with the invitations? So let's create an invitations folder.
Mm-hmm.
And these are invitations for our events.
Yes.
So I'm going to take an invitation that's definitely inside of there.
And just to
And
be
then
clear to the viewers, your editor is capable of refactoring packages as you're moving the classes around. Like this
when you say
project.
packages, you mean namespaces?
So I'm talking in in this case namespaces, yes. But what I am meaning is that the namespace adopts the folder path, right? So
Yeah.
the folder path has a much stronger naming in itself
Yeah,
than
definitely.
what we would normally use as a very technical lingo, right? So the folder is actually really important. So we're not just structuring all folder to be nice on disk, but we are actually structuring our folders because our naming convention for this kind of project enforces us to have the namespaces match our folder names. So it's even more important that we do this correctly.
Okay, let's continue with this because it's going to be really interesting very soon. So I'm moving the repository also there. I'm still undecided what to do with the attendee, but let's move it into the events because this is somebody attending an event, a specific event, which also means I can move the attendee repository.
We have a question for this. Can we introduce the aggregate concept?
Yeah,
here?
I saw that, and I want to tackle that in 2 or 3 minutes because this won't take much longer.
Perfect.
So I'll add one more folder, which I will call notifications, and I have just one entity left. Move it there. Move the notification repository, and now I can delete the entities folder and the repositories folder. So we're getting rid of things. Okay, let's see what I have in the services. So I have a friendship domain service. Okay, so not an interface, a domain service doing something in the domain. Let's move that in the friendships folder.
Makes sense.
Right?
Now, I would rename it though.
Okay, we can deal with the naming later.
Yeah.
Let me see where the password hash checker is used in the domain. So it's used in the user entity. So I'll move it in there.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And now I can delete the services folder.
Perfect.
Let me see where the name is used. So a bunch of places. Okay, this is used for events. So this is the name of the actual event. So let's move it there.
Yeah.
Get rid of the value objects folder.
Perfect.
And the only thing I'm left with is some core abstractions, which I'm going to leave like this, and a bunch of domain events.
Yeah, which are not using the same meaning of the word event.
Yes. So for the domain events,
kind of events.
Let's say we create a domain event folder, and then we just move them inside. So let me see. So group event, here are a bunch of events. Let's move these. There are also a few that I see for personal event. Okay, getting there. Just a few more.
And the invitation ones.
I see some for user. So 1, 2, 3.
Perfect.
All right. The invitation ones would also go there. Okay, and all of these are related to friendships. Let's just move the folder. And okay, enums category. What is this? I do believe this is also related to events. So let's move it here. Event type obviously also goes there.
Yep.
Notification type goes to notifications. Let me just find that folder.
We have a request in chat that if you could publish the after state on Git as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think this project,
it is. I am getting very inspired by what you're doing.
I think this project deserves some love from me after a few years. And here's what we're left with. So let me just delete the enumerations folder. And suddenly we have something in the domain that starts making sense.
Yes.
Right? You have your users and everything related to users inside. Notifications, although this is a technical concern, but let's say it's part of the domain.
Yes.
Invitations. I see we messed up some domain events that should have gone to the invitations folder.
I believe that was a drag and drop issue.
Yep. So these
invitations
should go here. Yeah, perfect. And so we have invitations, friendships, and events. And then we could possibly group the events further down the line, but I don't think this is necessary. And what you'll find is that these concepts here are repeated again in the application layer, right? You have users, events would be personal and group events, invitations are here, friendships, friendship requests also fall under friendships, and so on. So suddenly you're thinking in terms of cohesive groups of features, functionalities, whatever, in both layers. And I think this is really nice to wrap your head around. Okay.
I would much rather work in this project than what we started off with. And I think this is a
Yeah,
very good
definitely.
example of clean architecture and domain-driven design. You know
And
what
I mean, this is
am
something.
I am a bit time conscious. I just want to
Yeah.
comment on something that we encountered earlier. You know, when we
Mhm.
said that it's not ubiquitous, and I would disagree with that, because, you know, the worst thing, you know, an annoying thing that you can do in a business is say, well, you have events and I have events. Neither of us is allowed to use the word events anymore. You have to come up with a new word and I have to come up with a new word. That's super annoying, right? Because we're dictating language. Right? So what I would do instead is say, no, no, no. You have the word event and I have the word event. We just need to agree that we're working in different contexts, and we need to be able to express in what context this event is being used. So rather than forcing the event to be renamed the domain event and messaging event, that would be the enforced usage of the language. I would say, no, let's create a messaging folder and then let it have events. And let's create an invitations folder, or gatherings folder, and let that have events. Right? So I wouldn't prefix the word event. I would just put it into the folder that declares the context of the meaning of the word event, so that it captures the domain context, because maybe I have a user here and a user there, but I might actually need a folder to separate out which one I mean. And so I would say that the same word being used for different meanings should be encouraged, and it should be decorated with a namespace rather than being enforced to be prefixed. Because then you start seeing this sort of prefix things where I have this event, so now I have
No,
a
I wouldn't have.
domain event,
I wouldn't
and
have
I.
necessarily went with a prefix. I would have tried to come up with a better name.
A better name, yeah, agreed.
So I suggested replacing the concept of an event as a gathering.
Yes,
Maybe we call it gathering, right? Or we call it a
yes.
meetup or something like that.
But I would encourage you to only have this conversation if there's a non-technical person involved as well. If we're going to adopt
Yeah.
a word that the business uses naturally. If we, the engineers, start adding technical jargon just because we need a new word for
Yeah,
naming,
definitely.
then
I
that's
mean, if
artificial.
the
It's very
business is
synthetic.
using the concept of an event, then we also need that in the domain.
Yes, agreed.
All right. So can we also introduce the aggregate concept here?
Yes. Milan, are you happy continuing with the stream on your own? I do have to jump off to lead the book meeting club, the book club meeting in
I'm also constrained by time,
a few minutes.
unfortunately.
How much do you have left?
Just a few minutes.
Just a few minutes. Okay, then let's answer this question, and then let's
So,
pitch your course.
I started disliking the concept of an aggregate because I think it's becoming overused. And anybody getting into domain-driven design
Get super confused about how to use aggregates.
hears about the concept of an aggregate and thinks, I need to have this. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. You're perfectly fine with modeling your domain with entities without necessarily having to use like the concept of a fully fledged aggregate.
Yes.
And when I say aggregate, I mean an object that also encompasses a few related objects. So like you'll see the default example is an order with line items, right? So the order is this big aggregate that contains a bunch of line items inside.
Yes.
But it doesn't have to be modeled like that, especially not if the business doesn't think about it in that way, right? What if
Are
the
you
business
prepared?
cares?
Are you prepared to learn something new on this regard? Because
Please.
I had a conversation about exactly this with John Gallagher 2 weeks ago when we did a practical meeting, and I suggested that yes, it doesn't have to be modeled this way, and you should never create aggregates by force when you see a tree hierarchy in your entity relationships. That's not what aggregates are for. Aggregates. Okay, hang on. Yes, this is a much better. When aggregates are being used, we are writing aggregates in the domain-driven design meaning of the word only to encapsulate invariants, so rules, like the unique constraint, in a way that cannot be enforced with the infrastructure layer. I will give you an example. I will say an order has multiple line items, yes?
Yeah.
I can create a foreign key for that in a database,
Mm-hmm.
and that can easily be enforced. Now, I have an invariant where I say the discount is a line item, and I do not allow you to have a line item of a discount if there's no other line items that are positively buying something on the order.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a constraint that I cannot enforce with the database without stored procedures or something compute equivalent.
Yeah.
And that is a good example of using an aggregate, because rather than using a domain service to enforce that check, I would encapsulate that ownership of that check into an aggregate.
Mm-hmm.
That is a very good use case for an aggregate. And usually people use, instead of aggregates, what they do is they create domain services. You had one for the password hash and for the uniqueness check, the optimistic uniqueness check. That is the responsibility of an aggregate. But it is weird, right? Because I don't need the aggregate that says this store. But that's exactly what it is. But it's not a user. Right? The aggregate is this region where uniqueness of email means something. For when Meta acquired Instagram, their user space became two separate aggregates.
Mm-hmm.
And that's silly to model that way because you will never need it in its entirety in memory. So it would be silly to model it that way.
Yep.
Right? But it would be more useful to model the aggregate of who owns the claim to log in with this email. Right? So I would say the email has to be unique, but not necessarily. It just has to be claimed by the same person. Now that you cannot model with the database anymore. And then I would use an aggregate. Example,
Does every aggregate need a repository?
Does every aggregate need a repository? No, I wouldn't say so. There are scenarios, aggregates are allowed to hold references of other aggregates. If an aggregate has a one-to-one relationship with another aggregate, then the repository that checks the main aggregate can also immediately fetch the other aggregate if it needs it in memory.
Mm-hmm.
So I would empower the aggregate to actually be able to hold the thing that it's owning. Right? So for example, if I have a bank account and I can open one mortgage, if that is always a one-to-one relationship, because I can only, that might be a silly example, but for example, if I have a life savings account, I can only have one life savings account, or I can only have one life insurance account for my life, right? If I have an account open and I have an insurance account open, then it will be meaningful to only have one example in the aggregate. Right? So it's this idea that if the aggregate has a one-to-one relationship with another aggregate, and there is a sort of dominant side to this relationship, an owning side to this relationship, then I'm okay with some aggregates not having repositories. But that is an exception to the rule. I would say that that's the exception where I would say, yes, you should in general, except in this case. What do you think? You said aggregates, but what about entities that are aggregate roots? Like, should entities that are aggregate roots have their own non-aggregate repository? Right.
Hold on, repeat that.
Order line item.
Right.
Order is aggregate.
Right.
Should there be an order line repository? That's the more important question.
Okay. Right? So I mean, it depends, right? If I'm ever working with a concept of if I ever have a use case that's touching on a line item outside of the aggregate, then it makes sense. But that opens up the question of, do I even want to be working with a line item outside the concept of an aggregate?
Correct.
And then that opens up the second
responsibility of the order? Yeah.
Right. But then I would also question do I even need the aggregate? Like, what am I using the aggregate for? Is it enforcing something important? Because if that's not the case, then it's an unnecessary abstraction.
Exactly.
Where I could
am
just
I enforcing an important invariant? Yes.
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 So it could sometimes be simpler not to have an aggregate. But these are all very theoretical discussions. It makes much more sense when you touch on a real example. And
I can give you a real example. I
know you can. I just want to say whether you should use an aggregate or not is very open to interpretation, and it's something that you should handle for your specific project.
Yes.
Right. You'll never have two projects, let's say, that need the same things, because the constraints will be different, the use cases will be different, and so on.
I mean,
Okay.
And but I just wanna. Sorry, I'm not saying we need to stop. I'm just refocusing my camera. I'm what Manos just said. He has a point, right? So to iterate on your statement, I'm still here because the book club is having a delay, and I'm happy delaying for a little bit longer. There are projects where the orders are entities, and that's fine, and there are projects where the orders are aggregates, and that's fine, because it is the details of the business that define whether it needs to be an aggregate or not. It has nothing to do with technical decisions. Just because there's a hierarchy between the entities, a foreign key relationship, if you're modeling with a database, or if there is a sort of aggregate relationships in like a NoSQL kind of database, or where you're always aggregating some kind of view from the root of the tree. Like, for example, GraphQL, you say, give me all the latest posts for this user. You're always starting each query from the user side, right? So there's a sort of aggregation point from the user side. That doesn't mean that the user has to be the aggregate for, in all applications. In Reddit, it should be, right? Because but the only thing you can do on Reddit is post and comment, and it is very much, you're gathering points, and it's about you, the avatar, posting and commenting. So there, the user maybe should be an aggregate. In AWS, where I have a user because I log in and then I can have multiple users and I can belong to multiple organizations, the user is not the aggregate that needs to have the create VPC command. Right? Where on Reddit, it can be an aggregate, and then the post and post comment and leave comment and join community can be on the user aggregate. So those would be same name, same words, same concepts, which in different projects have different tactical patterns. I think that's a good expansion on it. And to give you an example on the order line, can order lines exist without an order? I would say no, because then they would just be orders. So if you create an order line without an order, that becomes an order, right? Because we're buying something. So it's the thing that we're buying. If it just becomes a single item order, then that's an order. And that's how you spot a natural aggregate. That when you take away some detail, it still is what you took away from it. Right? So for example, if you take away my name, I'm still Dennis. But now you have to refer to me somehow else. But if you keep stripping away my label, I still remain the person, right? So the aggregate still stays a strong aggregate. Whereas you can debate whether, okay, my name is now X, and then my name is Dennis, and then my name is something else. I'm still the same person. So the aggregate is person, but I just have labels. I have titles, I have labels, I have first name, last name. I might have a middle name. I might have a fourth name. Like I might have a composite name, a preferred name, first name, last family name. And then it becomes a sort of localization problem. It's like, how do you want your entities to be localized, personalized, customized for your business problem? We always need to bring it back to business problem. And that's what we want to do in clean architecture. We want to distill the technical, this is a repository, this is an entity, this is an aggregate, this is a table, this is a stored procedure. And we want to take these technical concerns and strip away, clean away all the unnecessary jargon to express the needs of your current business. And that's what clean architecture is about. On that topic, can I add it to the stage?
Yeah. All right. So if you enjoyed what we talked about in the last hour or so, especially the concepts around building out your domain, around features, how you should structure your use cases in the application layer, and the other things that we didn't get to touch on, I cover all of those things in my Pragmatic Clean Architecture course. You'll find it slightly different than most of the implementations of clean architecture out there, which is the pragmatic part. Mainly where it's different is how I like to think about what a use case is in terms of a command and a query. and using the right tool for the job for each one of those. Now, I'll give you just a little secret for the people that are still in the live stream. If you go to my Patreon account and become a subscriber, you'll get access to a 30% discount, which you can use to purchase the course.
Can we drop a link to your Patreon account?
Yes. I don't think I can join the chat.
You can send it to me on the private chat, and I'll send it.
Yes, I'll do it. Just give me a moment. Yes, I sent it.
Okay, sent. There we go.
Yep.
So it's patreon.com/Milan Jovanovic.
Okay. Maybe you can send them the course link also.
Yes, I just saw the comment. I'm sending the course link. Do you still have it?
It should be the last message in the chat.
Yes. There we go. So just lost it. There we go. That's the course link.
Yep.
Right.
All right. If anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. That's where I'm most responsive. In the YouTube comments, on Twitter, wherever you like. Or you can even send me an email if you're old school.
Absolutely. Milan, thank you for joining me today. It was a lot of fun. I know it can be a little bit. I didn't give you a lot of time to prepare. I love that we ad-libbed it on a real project, and thank you for updating the project. I think we got a lot of inspiration from seeing.
I'm pushing that to GitHub so everyone can see what are the changes that we made.
Yeah, the link is already in chat. I posted it in chat when before you joined, so we have a history there. I'll post a recap on Tuesday, and it'll have all the important links on the newsletter.
That's awesome.
For those of you who are still live, we are hosting crafting tech teams. We are hosting a new book club next month in October. It will be about team of teams, so about how to split up your large teams into smaller teams, and how to divide and conquer without making a huge mess with inter-department politics. So we'll be doing speed reading and that book specifically. And this cohort this week is finishing implementing lean software development. So expect some posts on that on the crafting tech teams newsletter, and I'll drop that in chat as well for those of you. But I think, let's be honest, I think most of you are already very loyal fans. Thank you so much for your support. Milan, thank you for being here. And before we sign off, Saddam had a question. And Saddam had a question that I glanced over because I said I will answer it at the end. And now we're at the end. So Saddam, let me find your question, which was?
It was basically, how do you prep for a coding interview?
Yeah, so specifically, should I do lead code? Should I join problem-solving sites? I'm asking this because I recently faced challenges in remote job interviews. Some companies require coding tests directly related to lead code.
So maybe I can answer this from some fresh memory. I had a few interviews last year, and I knew it would be coding interviews, and I did exactly that, basically. Lead code or similar websites, find problems that are challenging, and try to solve as many of them as you can.
Yes.
But it's not just a game of, it is a game of numbers, to be honest. Like the more you solve, the better you will be. But the more important aspect is picking up on the ideas, because most of the problems are going to revolve around a few main ideas that you can then apply to any coding interview challenge that you run into.
Yeah. My suggestion is I do sit on both sides of the table. I sometimes coach engineering managers who have to recruit people, and they might get they might post a job ad and they get thousands, and they're like, okay, well, how do I sort through this? Okay, it's like, should I even bother talking to all of them? Like, I don't have enough time in the month to talk to all thousands of them. Like, what should I do? So what I can tell you is that, just holistically speaking, your best bet is to find a job and gain experience. So absolutely, do lead code, but don't make solving lead code your main job. I see a lot of engineers not interviewing because they want the perfect score on lead code, and they obsess. I used to be a hardcore World of Warcraft raider. I had a schedule. It was my second job, but I made it my job. But I'm not, I wouldn't say obsessively solve lead code problems to the extent that you're investing more time in lead code than you do in your own personal growth. Doing lead code problems has diminishing returns, right? So you have to learn what to do when you face a problem you haven't seen before. That's the important part. That's your normal mode of operation. I haven't seen this problem before. I haven't prepared for it. What will I do? And in the interview, I would say, I will look up lead code and I will look for the solution. Because that's what a normal engineer would do. Like, I would try to solve it, and then I would try a few solutions, and I will try to understand those solutions. And sometimes seeing the solutions will bias me, so I'll try to solve it myself, and then I'll check the solutions to gain new ideas once I already established the bias. But this idea that having a score of 500, 1,000 hard lead code problems, that's silly. If anything, I would recommend John Crickett's newsletter on Substack or LinkedIn, because he has this idea of learning by solving real challenges. So you'll build a calculator, you'll build an interface which is compatible with the Spotify protocol, you'll build a Redis client, right? So you learn these concepts. Some of these algorithmic, some of them are data structure oriented, but you'll learn them on real world katas. If you ask me, if you want to increase your chances of getting hired, make yourself more likable. What you don't want to do is don't become a stressed out, sort of overloaded introvert when you face a problem that you haven't solved before. Talk about your experience on the interview. Make yourself become hireable, likable. Make it be fun. Be the not knower. Be the person who says, I don't know how to solve this, but this is what I'm gonna do to find out. I would much rather have that kind of interviewee than having somebody who I give them a problem and they know how to solve it because they've solved it already 5 times in lead code. Because I want to see how they behave when they don't know a problem. If you go to Google, that's what they do. They never give you lead code problems. They give you an open-ended problem because they will always push your level of understanding to the point that you haven't prepared for. Right? So they will always push the problem to the difficulty level where it goes just beyond your preparation because they want to see how you act when you don't know how to solve a problem. That's what they want with these problems. That's why they're always coming up with new ones. And these websites are creating this fear of missing out that we know which lead code problems Google uses. We know which lead code problem Microsoft uses. And then they try to monetize it and make $1 off of you guys not having a job. Don't fall for those tricks. That's just FOMO. If you want to get hired, understand if you're competing with 10,000 other candidates, lead code is not the best solution. Experience is. So optimize getting hired, not, optimize the entire value stream. Getting hired, having work experience, not just lead code experience. That would be my holistic advice. And don't be afraid of saying, I don't know. That's probably the biggest, engineering advice that I can give. Saddam, thank you for that question. Great question. Thank you. Milan, signing off now. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me. It was awesome.
And thank you all for joining us live. And next month, the next few weeks, I am opening up the topic of refactoring. So from next week onward, for the next few weeks, it's going to be refactoring. Thank you all for joining. Milan, you're awesome. And see you all next time. Signing off. And here's some extra elevator music. Enjoy!